And every single time I've tried to do it privately, there have been briefings and leakings and planting of stories against me and my wife. You know, the family motto is never complain, never explain. The corresponding...
Something changed around Prince Harry and Meghan when their public lives began moving in different directions. Harry was spending more time with Invictus, veterans, Britain, and causes tied to his old life. Meghan was building lifestyle, entertainment, and commercial projects in California. At first, that looked like two people working separately. Then the questions started. Why was Harry traveling alone? Why was Meghan appearing without him? Why did their public lives suddenly look so different? And eventually, the speculation became much darker. Online stories began saying Harry had discovered secret affairs and demanded a divorce. That allegation spread because it hit the most painful part of Harry's history. He had already left Britain. He had already stepped away from royal duty. He had already damaged relationships with his father and brother. And he had defended Meghan through years of criticism. So if betrayal reached him after all of that, the damage would not stop at the marriage. It would reach every sacrifice he had made to protect it. That is what made the divorce story explode. The emotional history was already there. And once Harry and Meghan started appearing apart more often, people began reading every decision through that lens. A solo trip looked different. A separate project looked different. A return to Britain looked different. Even silence looked different. The question became much more personal. Had Harry simply built a separate professional life? Or had something happened inside the marriage that pushed him toward the one decision nobody expected him to make? To understand why that question became so powerful, you have to go back to the moment their public lives first started separating. Because before the betrayal story appeared, the distance was already visible. When their public lives started moving apart, Harry and Meghan once appeared almost everywhere as a single unit. Interviews, charitable work, royal appearances, and major announcements usually carried both names. After moving to North America, that continued for a while. They launched projects together, built Archewell together, and presented their new life as something they had chosen as a family. But over time, their public roles started looking less connected. Harry leaned harder into veterans, Invictus, and causes, carrying pieces of his old identity. Meghan moved toward entertainment, lifestyle work, and projects built around her own name. That change created a completely different picture. Harry could spend days traveling for Invictus without Meghan beside him. Meghan could appear at an event in California while Harry was somewhere else. One schedule became two. One public brand began looking more like two separate careers sharing the same home. And when a couple has spent years being watched as closely as Harry and Meghan, even ordinary distance starts attracting meaning. Then the emotional context made everything heavier. Harry had not simply changed jobs when he left Britain, he had changed his entire life. The move affected his relationship with the monarchy, his place inside the family, and the way he spoke about his childhood. So when he began spending more time around Britain and old causes again, people started asking whether the life he left behind was pulling him back. And once that question was in the air, the next one came quickly. Where did Meghan fit if Harry's attention was moving in another direction? There was another reason the change felt important. For years, Harry and Meghan had sold their public identity as a partnership formed under pressure. They had survived palace conflict together, moved together, and built a new home together. So when that combined image loosened, people did not see an ordinary career adjustment. They saw the first visible crack in something that had always been presented as united. Meghan builds a life that looks more like her own. Meghan's work in California began taking on a different shape. Lifestyle projects, entertainment, commercial partnerships, and media appearances increasingly reflected her own identity rather than the Sussexes as one combined brand. She had always had interests separate from Harry, but the difference became more visible when their schedules stopped overlapping as often. To viewers watching from outside, the change felt bigger because the couple had spent years presenting major decisions as something they made together. That is when professional independence began feeding personal speculation. Meghan, at one event without Harry, became a talking point. Harry, at another event without Meghan, became another one. Then every new photograph was treated like a clue. People who had already decided the marriage was under pressure could fit almost anything into that idea. A separate arrival, a separate trip, a project announced under one name. None of those moments had to be dramatic on its own. Together, they created a picture of two people moving through very different worlds. And then, the darker allegation entered that gap. The affair story did not appear in a vacuum. It appeared after months of people already asking why Harry and Meghan looked less connected publicly. That is why it traveled so quickly. The accusation took ordinary distance and gave it a cause. Suddenly, separate careers were no longer just separate careers. They became the beginning of a betrayal narrative. And if Harry had really come to believe something had happened behind his back, the question was no longer why they were appearing apart. It became how much of his life he would be willing to lose again. The more Meghan's brand became her own, the more Harry's absence became part of the image. That did not require an argument or a dramatic scene. Sometimes distance becomes powerful simply because people notice what is no longer happening. Fewer joint appearances, different priorities, different rooms, different audiences. And once viewers started seeing two separate directions instead of one shared path, every rumor found somewhere to land. Harry had already given up almost everything once. In 2020, Harry and Meghan stepped back from senior royal duties and eventually built their life in North America. That decision changed Harry's relationship with the institution that had shaped him since birth. It also changed his relationship with King Charles and Prince William. The disagreements did not stay private. Interviews, documentaries, and Harry's memoir Spare pushed family tensions into public view, and Harry repeatedly connected those choices with protecting Meghan and their children. That history is why the betrayal allegation lands so hard. Harry did not defend the marriage quietly. He defended it in front of the world. He argued that pressure from the press and the royal system had become damaging. He moved across an ocean. He accepted that family relationships might never return to what they had been. And through all of it, he presented Meghan and the children as the family he had chosen to protect first. So imagine what betrayal would mean to someone carrying that history. It would not only be about another person entering a marriage. It would force Harry to look back at every decision made after 2020. The move, the interviews, the fights with William, the distance from Charles, the years spent defending Meghan against people who said the marriage would eventually isolate him. That is why the divorce allegation became so powerful. It did not need to invent a new emotional wound. The wound was already built into Harry's past. Harry had also spent years insisting that leaving royal life was not an act of weakness. He framed it as a choice made to protect his family and regain control. That makes any later marriage crisis especially painful. If the relationship he protected became unstable, critics would immediately reinterpret everything he had done. And Harry would know that. A private betrayal would instantly become a public judgment on his biggest decision. The affair claim becomes Harry's breaking point. By the time the affair and divorce allegation began spreading, the emotional sequence almost wrote itself. Harry discovers something private. He realizes the marriage he defended may not be what he believed. Anger turns into confrontation. And then, the one person who had spent years choosing Meghan over almost everything else finally reaches a breaking point. That is the part people kept returning to. Harry is not known for hiding emotion when something feels deeply personal. he has spoken openly about grief, resentment, family conflict, and the pressure he felt growing up inside the monarchy. So the idea that betrayal could trigger a huge reaction felt believable to people who already knew how intensely he talks about loyalty. The allegation worked because it matched the version of Harry the public already understands. Someone who can tolerate enormous pressure until trust itself feels broken. And once the word divorce entered the conversation, every older decision looked different. Harry's solo trips became more important. Meghan's separate projects became more important. His renewed time in Britain became more important. Even his relationship with his father suddenly became part of the same picture. If the marriage was under real pressure, Harry would not only be deciding whether to leave Meghan, he would be deciding what kind of life was waiting for him after her. That is why the word divorce carried more weight than separation. Separation can leave room for distance, repair, and time. Divorce sounds final. It forces the future into focus. Where do you live? Who do you trust? What remains shared? Which relationships return? For Harry, those questions would reach far beyond Meghan because his marriage had become the center of the life he built after leaving the crown. Britain starts pulling Harry back into the picture. Harry's connection with Britain never disappeared completely. Invictus, veterans, court battles, family events, and his father's health repeatedly brought him back into a country he had left under enormous tension. Each return carried its own meaning. Sometimes it was practical, sometimes emotional. But every trip reminded people that Harry still had unfinished relationships there. That became especially important once the divorce story appeared. If Harry were ever forced to rethink his life in California, Britain would immediately become part of the conversation. Not because he could simply return to the old royal role as if nothing happened. Too much had changed. But because his father, his brother, his childhood, his charities, and much of his identity were still tied to that country. A marriage crisis would not erase the conflict with the family. It would make those relationships more important than they had been in years. And that creates one of the most uncomfortable possibilities in the entire story. Harry spent years moving away from the palace because he believed distance protected his marriage. If the marriage itself became the source of pain, the direction of his life would suddenly reverse. The man who left Britain for Meghan could find himself looking back toward Britain because of Meghan. And before any decision like that could become simple, two people would stand at the center of everything: Archie and Lilibet. His visits to Britain also kept reminding people that Harry's old world was not completely gone. He could criticize it, distance himself from it, and still be pulled back by family, duty, or memory. That contradiction matters. A man can leave a place without leaving what it means to him. And if California ever stopped feeling secure, Britain would become emotionally present again, whether Harry wanted it or not. Archie and Lilibet turn a private break into a family crisis. Harry has always spoken about his children as one of the main reasons he wanted a different life. Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet grew up in California, away from the daily structure of royal life. That gave Harry something he repeatedly suggested he had wanted for them: more privacy, more control, and less of the pressure that shaped his own childhood. A serious break with Meghan would make that entire arrangement complicated overnight. Harry could be angry. Meghan could be angry. But the children would still need stability. Their home, school, security, travel, and relationship with both parents would suddenly matter more than whatever caused the marriage to fracture. Harry has spent years saying he wanted to protect them from chaos. So if the relationship reached a breaking point, he would have to manage the kind of family instability he had tried to escape. And then there is Britain. Archie and Lilibet are not only Harry and Meghan's children, they are grandchildren of King Charles and remain part of the royal line. A major marital rupture would pull the monarchy emotionally closer, whether anyone wanted that or not. Grandparents, security, travel, and Harry's own connection with Britain would all sit around the same problem. That is why a divorce demand would never be only about Harry and Meghan. It would reopen the entire family map. For Archie and Lilibet, the emotional problem would be simpler and harder at the same time. They would not care about headlines, titles, or who won an argument years earlier. They would care about where their parents were, whether home still felt stable, and how much of their life suddenly changed. That is why any real break would force Harry to think beyond anger. He would have to protect them from the consequences of his own decision. The palace would be pulled back into Harry's life. Buckingham Palace spent years keeping public distance from Harry and Meghan's private decisions. Harry was no longer a working senior royal. Meghan had built a life outside the institution, and the palace had every reason to avoid becoming part of another personal conflict. But a marriage collapse involving Harry would be almost impossible for the family to ignore emotionally. King Charles would be dealing with his son, not simply the Duke of Sussex. William would be dealing with the brother who had spent years accusing the family of failing to understand his marriage. And every old argument would return with a different meaning. Was Harry right to leave? Did the family push him away? Did he isolate himself too far? Was the marriage carrying more pressure than anyone around them understood? A private break could reopen questions the palace had spent years trying to move beyond. For Harry, that would be brutal. Returning emotionally toward the family would mean facing people he had criticized publicly. It would mean asking for support from relationships already damaged by years of conflict. And if betrayal really sat at the center of the marriage crisis, Harry would also be carrying humiliation into those conversations. That is why the divorce allegation feels larger than celebrity gossip. It places Harry between the family he left and the family he built, and William would be impossible to remove from that picture. The brothers had once shared grief, duty, and the same public future. Their relationship later fractured around decisions connected partly to Harry's marriage. If Harry suddenly faced a collapse inside that marriage, William would become more than an estranged brother. He would become someone who remembered Harry before Meghan, before California, and before the family split apart. Why their public connection made the story even stranger. Even while separation rumors grew, Harry and Meghan remained connected publicly through family messaging, selected projects, and shared charitable interests. That gave the story a strange tension. On one side, their careers looked increasingly separate. On the other, they still appeared tied together in ways that did not look like a clean break. That is actually what made people watch more closely. If they had simply announced separate lives, the speculation would have ended in one direction. Instead, the public saw something more complicated. Harry could pursue his own causes while Meghan built hers. They could appear apart, then still be connected through family or work. The marriage looked less like the tightly linked partnership people remembered from 2020, but it did not look like two people who had completely walked away from each other either. And that ambiguity gave the affair allegation room to grow. Every public connection could be read as an attempt to hold the family together. Every separate appearance could be read as proof that the distance was growing. Once betrayal entered the conversation, people began watching for a moment when one side would stop maintaining the old image. A missing ring, a cancelled appearance, a sudden trip, a change in language. Something that would show the private tension had finally reached the surface. That uncertainty is exactly why every small public moment began carrying too much weight. A smile could be read as reassurance. A solo appearance could be read as distance. One affectionate reference could quiet the rumors for a day, then another separate schedule would start them again. The marriage became something people tried to read from fragments. And once the affair allegation existed, Every fragment seemed to carry a hidden meaning. The divorce story becomes about what Harry can still forgive. The longer the speculation continued, the more the question moved away from schedules and toward character. Harry has forgiven many things publicly. He has spoken about trying to understand his father. He has talked about wanting some form of relationship with his family even after brutal disagreements. But betrayal inside his marriage would strike at a completely different part of him. Loyalty matters deeply in the way Harry tells his own story. He describes relationships through protection, trust, and abandonment. His grief over Diana, his anger toward the press, his resentment toward the palace, his frustration with William. Again and again, the emotional language comes back to who protected whom, who failed whom, and who stood beside whom when pressure arrived. That makes romantic betrayal one of the few wounds that could hit every part of his identity at once. So when people say Harry demanded divorce after discovering secret affairs, the reason the allegation feels believable is not because the public knows what happened inside the marriage. It is because people know how Harry reacts when loyalty collapses. He does not usually treat betrayal as a small disagreement. He turns it into a line between before and after. And if that line were ever crossed inside his marriage, the hardest question would not be whether he became angry. It would be whether he could ever trust Meghan the same way again. There is also something deeply personal about Harry's history with abandonment. Losing Diana at 12 left a wound he has spoken about for years. Family conflict later added another layer. So the idea of being betrayed by the person he chose as his closest partner would not land on empty ground. It would hit an old fear that the people closest to him can suddenly become unreachable. The breaking point that would change everything. Go back through the last several years. Harry and Meghan leave royal life. They move to North America. Harry speaks openly about protecting his wife and children. Family relationships break down. The couple builds a new public identity together. Then, slowly, their professional lives start separating. Harry returns more often to old causes and old connections. Meghan builds projects that look increasingly like her own. And into that distance comes the allegation that Harry discovered secret affairs and finally demanded divorce. That is why the story refuses to disappear. It connects almost every unresolved part of Harry's life at once. His marriage, his children, his father, his brother, Britain, California, the sacrifices he made after 2020, and the one thing he has always spoken about as if it matters more than status: loyalty. If Harry ever reached the point where he believed that loyalty had been broken inside his own marriage, the decision would be bigger than walking away from Meghan. He would have to decide what remained of the life he built around her. What happens to California? What happens to the children? What happens to the distance from Britain? What happens to the family relationships he damaged while defending the marriage? And what happens when the person you protected against everyone else becomes the person you feel you need protection from? That is the real emotional force behind the divorce story. Harry had already walked away from one world for Meghan. A betrayal would force him to ask whether he was willing to walk away from another. And maybe that is why the idea of divorce feels so explosive around him, because there is no clean direction left. Returning to Britain would not erase the past. Staying in California would not erase the damage. Separating would affect the children. Reconciliation would require trust. Every path asks Harry to give something up again. And after years of choosing Meghan over almost everyone else, the most painful possibility would be discovering that the marriage itself had become the place where he finally could not stay. If you are enjoying this investigation, subscribe, because Harry's next major move will tell us far more than another week of speculation. And tell me in the comments, After everything Harry gave up to build this life, what betrayal could he actually forgive? And if trust inside the marriage was truly broken, would he choose Meghan again? Or finally walk away?